When he ran for president in 1976, he ran as an orthodox budget balancer,
Right.
complete with a proposal to reduce the federal budget by $90 billion. That's at a time when the budget was $300 billion. It's a huge reduction in the federal budget.
He was just returning those functions to the states. Ronald Reagan used to say things like this, quote, I say there are simple answers to many of our problems, simple but hard, unquote. He's gotten a lot of grief over the years for being a kind of simplifier and for allegedly neglecting the complications of policymaking that experts are expert in. How do you answer that kind of criticism, and in particular in his domestic policy, where on the great issue of the economy he came around to his own version of Reaganomics, right. Relying heavily on supply side theory. What do you think about his use of supply side? It was a breakthrough in a way at the time. In retrospect, what do you think of it, and do you think that maybe he helped to delegitimize deficits, or to legitimize, deficits more than he should have?
Yeah, well, that's a complicated question. I think first thing I'd say is Reagan's embrace of supply-side economics shows his great adaptability, and that he wasn't sort of fixed in stone in certain ways. I mean, when he ran for president in 1976, he ran as an orthodox budget balancer,
right.
complete with a proposal to reduce the federal budget by $90 billion. That's at a time when the budget was $300 billion. It's a huge reduction in the federal budget.
He was just returning those functions to the states.
From the states, right? A perfectly sound idea, but
exactly,
it left him open to huge attacks about what would it mean for a low-tax state like New Hampshire that votes first.
Yes,
so,
right.
arguably politically imprudent, but that was his idea, and he was always good at defending those ideas. By 1980, he's still for reducing federal spending. But he's embraced the idea of tax cuts, which, remember, Barry Goldwater voted against the Kennedy tax cuts way back when. And Republican orthodoxy had always been cut spending and then we can cut taxes, except guess what never happens. So he embraced the growth logic of supply-side economics, which I continue to think is correct. Circumstances are different today, but that's another story. And I think there was a lively debate throughout his presidency, and I think he sat back and just let it go on. With bemusement on his part, between people who said, well, let's cut taxes and it will starve the beast. And it will compel Congress to spend less. Right. Versus other people who said the path of the old orthodox Republicans, like David Stockman, who said, no, we've just got to be virtuous, like farmers from the Midwest where Stockman was from, and not spend like that. And they both have good points, and there have been long debates about that ever since amongst technical economists. So Reagan may have been wise to stand back and say, who knows.
Wasn't there a third position? That is, at least publicly there seemed to be, that is that you could cut taxes and feed the beast. Right. I mean, the argument was you'd have more revenues, more tax revenues coming in off a bigger base.
Right.
And so you wouldn't have to make painful cuts on the domestic side.
Right. Well, now that was the view that Jack Kemp often held, Art Laffer held. One of the things that is, and Reagan himself once in a while would say that in his, say, off-the-cuff comments at press conferences. One of the things that you discover when you go through the documents is his actual economic team, the people who were hired at Treasury, never once projected higher revenues from the income tax cuts.
Is that right?
They thought they would backfill and have higher growth about 5 or 6 years out, and thought it would also thought, one part that's been forgotten, this would be anti-inflationary. Exactly the opposite of orthodox economics. Jimmy Carter said, you cut taxes, will be inflationary. And Reagan, again, showing his keenness of mind, in that debate, he shot back, why is it inflationary for people to keep and spend their own money, but not inflationary for you to tax it and spend it? Great question, right? So he understood several parts of the logic of supply-side economics, but their own budget projections never said it's going to pay for itself right away from day one. That was the really Jude Winniski and the really enthusiastic supply-siders. There's another part of the story, which is Federal Reserve monetary policy that gets very complicated, and that was very contentious too. So they did always try to emphasize budget cutting at the same time. They had a tiny bit of success. The famous Reagan budget cuts were much oversold by the media, did not amount to very much. There were some, but, and they made, I think it's arguable they made a mistake by leaving entitlements and what Reagan liked to call the social safety net out of the items that they were going to cut back. So they mostly went after things like food stamp eligibility and certain other discretionary spending programs, and said we're going to leave Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and some of these other things alone. And that was probably a mistake, because that's now, and has been since then, where the largest growth in federal spending is taking place.
Although Bill Vogeley has shown that Reagan did reduce the rate of growth to almost nothing on the welfare side, as it were, the social welfare side of the federal budget.
Yes, that's right. If now that we have this 30-year record to look at, Reagan looks pretty good. He's most successful of any president in controlling spending.
He didn't reverse any growth, but he did really lower the curve amazingly.
Right. Well, you could really tell, I mean, one little detail I think that's fun is when David Stockman left in 1985, and he'd been kind of a collaborator with the enemy as the spenders and taxers. He replaced him with Jim Miller, and the Democrats up in Congress tried to prohibit Miller from coming to budget meetings on Capitol Hill. That was a sign that things were getting rough. And they did have some success in the second term in restraining growth.